Good evening, everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach at Parents Defending Education, and I want to welcome you to our live stream tonight. This evening is dedicated to social emotional learning. What is it? What does it have to do with my child's school? And what, if anything, can we do about it if we see red flags and have concerns? There is a lot to cover on this topic, so we're going to break this live stream into two parts. First, we're going to break down for you what social emotional learning, also known as SEL, is. And then for part two, we're going to talk about what it looks like in our schools and how parents are responding. We are very lucky to have an expert in social emotional learning. Her name is Jennifer McWilliams, and she is a mom from Indiana and a reading specialist, or former reading specialist, I should say, at the elementary school level, who was fired after raising concerns about the social emotional learning program being implemented in her school. She has since become what we would call an expert in social emotional learning and has started a consulting business to try to raise awareness about what SEL is and what it isn't. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Erika.
So, we're just going to have you walk us through what social emotional learning is, and to do it in a way that a person who knows nothing about this subject or has never even heard of it can understand.
Sure. So social emotional learning, or a lot of people will call it SEL, is a system that schools are using to transform the education system in a way that places the focus on a child's attitudes, morals, values, and beliefs rather than academic excellence. And they will tell you that social emotional learning is a way to teach children empathy, how to manage their emotions, and build relationships. But what these programs do is use innocuous language like social emotional learning that sounds nice to cover the Trojan horse that it is for bringing in all of the critical race theory ideology, the gender identity, sexual orientation, and social justice education. So it is just a cover for bringing in all of these issues that parents defending education and organizations across our country are bringing awareness to. And I like to tell people that critical race theory is the ideology, but social emotional learning is the delivery system of that ideology into our education system. The social emotional learning comes from CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And people would recognize some of the funders as the Gates Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And some of SEL is, it, like I said, it sounds nice. So a lot of parents may see some of this at the school and not realize that the social emotional learning skills or competencies that they're influencing these children with are influenced through the viewpoint of a critical race theorist. And so, of course, they cover that up with a word like equity, which you will hear often. And in 2019, CASEL developed the social emotional learning into what they called transformative social emotional learning, and it was to promote equity. And it actually states within their documentation that it is to promote justice-oriented civic engagement and to dismantle and transform what they call inequitable systems. So through social emotional learning and this heavy influence on identities, oppression, biases, they are teaching children basically to become social justice warriors to create new social norms.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I don't think that people probably understand how important it is to focus on the change that has taken place in
Mhm.
social emotional learning. So I know that you mentioned that there's been a shift to
Mhm.
transformative SEL. Can you just in like 30 seconds say how much of a driver that is in what social emotional learning is looking like in schools now versus what it may have looked like 5 or 10 years ago?
Sure. So, you know, 10 years ago, the social emotional learning would be more like character education and what people still are uh, assume that it is today. They think that they're just teaching kids to be respectful and follow the rules. But social emotional learning is a full school transformation of it's a culture shift. And that culture shift is through the transformative social emotional learning. And it is all in order to uh, teach these children that basically that our country and all of the systems within it are oppressive. And they do this in many ways. The kids are bombarded with propaganda throughout the day. The social emotional learning programs are meant to be incorporated into every aspect of the school system. That's why I call the social emotional learning an actual system, because it is eventually it will take over everything, and that includes academics, the extracurricular activities. You know, it is meant to influence everything in a child's day. And they talk often about shifting the lens of the children. And so they do this. Basically, the social emotional learning is to psychologically manipulate children to believe the way of the critical race theory ideology. And they are training these children to believe that idea and then eventually to work to dismantle what they call the inequitable systems. And that's really concerning for people because they believe that all of our systems in this country are inequitable. So the whole social emotional learning is if it's coming from Castle, is based on shifting the lens of the children. However, of course, years ago, and there are still some schools that may not use the full transformative SEL, and that's why it's important for parents to understand what it is so they can, make sure it doesn't go into that area.
So that's actually really an important point and something that I wanted to mention. We are not here to terrify or scare parents about social emotional learning. However, because of this very significant shift in the definition in how Castle defines social emotional learning, it is at least important that parents know, is the social emotional learning happening in my child's good school part of a program that carries the stamp of approval from Castle? Because if it is, then there is a very good chance that they are using transformative social emotional learning. And I, as a parent, would at least want to dig deeper and see exactly what that looks like. Certainly, I was in a classroom as recently as 6 years ago, and the materials that I'm seeing now under the umbrella of SEL look nothing like what it was when I was working in a school. So thank you for mentioning that. And also, I just want to be sure that, again, we don't terrify you, but we certainly want to raise awareness and at least give you the tools that you need to ask the right questions. Okay. So we really did want this live stream to be extremely practical. And one of the best ways to do that is to share with you real life examples of lessons and content in schools currently in the country that fall under the SEL umbrella. So we're going to leave the background on SEL there. I'm sure that all of you researcher types and detective types will go do some investigation afterwards. But now we're going to talk about actual stories and incidents that have been shared with us by parents from different parts of the country. And for that, I am going to introduce my colleague, Rhyen Staley. Rhyen is a former teacher at the middle school, high school, and college level, and he is currently the researcher for us at Parents Defending Education. Hey, Rhyen, thanks for joining us.
How are we doing? So Jennifer, one of the stories that we wanted to highlight was dealing with Penn High School there in Indiana. And Penn High School, in a teacher's professional development, gave a lesson plan that they wanted the teachers to execute that involved using the pyramid of white supremacy, or the pyramid of oppression. And what we want to talk about is in this professional development, it draws upon Ibram X. Kendi. It draws upon Robin DiAngelo, and it talks about how to, basically implement anti-racism into the SEL curriculum. Can you expand upon how this plays in with CASEL and their programming with transformative SEL, and I guess what effect this is going to have on the students?
So this this school is obviously fully into the transformative SEL, and that's why we are raising the awareness about it. So CASEL set their framework wants to teach children 5 competencies or skills, and those competencies are self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And they all sound nice again, but when children are being influenced with lessons like this pyramid of white supremacy, the idea behind that is to get the children to understand what their identities are, and start making decisions based on what they are, their identities are perceived to be through this type of ideology. So really it's to influence children, again, that we live in a system of oppressed and oppressors, and who are you in that system, and to influence them to start making decisions based on that. And so that's how it plays into the competencies from CASEL.
So what with this pyramid of white supremacy, for maybe people that are not as familiar with it, at the top of it, it says it's eventually will lead to genocide. And of course, up at the top, you have groups that they list, such as MAGA, which is, Make America Great Again, things as costumes, etc. And so, one of the things that's concerning is you talk about they want to shift the perceptions of these young learners towards groups, in groups and out groups. What does this do for, let's say this is high school, so let's stick with the high school age for now. What does this do for the students in terms of peer relationships?
So it divides them, right? So it puts them all into a group, and they're figuring out where they fit in. And then the whole idea of teaching them this is that they want to influence them and to see where the inequitable systems are and how they can dismantle it. And that's their words, that's CASEL's words about dismantling the inequitable systems. But they can only do that if they can influence these children to believe that way. And so, that's when you're getting to the top talking about genocide. I mean, that's fear tactics on these children when you are taking SEL this far.
The anti-racism piece, let's dig on that a little bit longer, because how does that, where does that come from, and how are they justifying that as social emotional learning?
The social emotional learning with the anti-racist and what they would call unconscious bias, right, is because they just say that racism is prevalent in our country in all systems, and that if you don't see it, you're just a product of this white supremacy culture that they say is dominant in our country. And so that's why they're trying to get the children to see all of like that diagram. And so then once they have the children thinking, oh, well, I may not be part of, I don't see the racism, but other people do, then they use the perceptions of those children that will, play into that to influence the other children that don't see it. And it's just a whole system where they are influencing children across the board where they lie.
Right. And I want to reiterate that this is a professional development document. However, being a teacher myself, and you a teacher, and Erika, former teacher, we know that this stuff doesn't just stay in professional development, that there's a reason that they're showing this to educators, right? That this, I mean, and if could you speak to that a little bit more about how this stuff filters from a professional development into the classroom?
Yes. So obviously professional development for teachers, the purpose of that is to take what they learn and develop their profession into the classroom. So they're influencing these, even the teachers. And a lot of the younger teachers obviously are coming out of the universities. So this idea is pushed also in the universities, and they come into the schools, and it just carries over. And so what they do is they teach the teachers, they say, they go to the extreme with this white supremacy pyramid. And then they say, well, you need to do these SEL lessons in the classroom to start to get the children to compromise and make decisions based on these ideas. But they aren't necessarily bringing in that specific pyramid into the classroom and showing children, but they're influencing them with that idea.
Good. Thanks, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I should add actually that we have seen evidence of that pyramid also being used with students. I don't remember if it was under the umbrella of SEL or not, but that's a document that has become quite ubiquitous in K-12 education recently. All right, thank you guys for that.
Yeah.
Next up is my pal, Marissa. Marissa is my colleague. She is our... Wait, what is your title? Yes, Director of Advocacy.
Director of Advocacy, yeah.
Mom of boys like me. And she is going to talk to us about sort of another shocking incident in relation to social emotional learning as it pertains to surveys.
So thank you. So nice to be with all of you tonight. Something that's been really exploding in K through 12, and a way of getting this social emotional learning, kind of taking it to the next level and really embedding it in the schools, is in addition to the SEL lessons and instruction that's going on, there has been a massive increase in the amount of social emotional learning surveys that children are being given. And this is from 3rd grade to 12th grade typically. So part of the surveys, the children are taking them in school. They're taking them often on their school issued laptops. There's a lot of confusion about these surveys, and there's a lot of lack of transparency surrounding the surveys. Parents do have the opportunity to opt out, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But parents don't always know they have the opportunity to opt out, and it takes initiative on the part of the parent to opt out. So we had a really interesting tip reported to us back in November. In Barrington School District in Rhode Island, they were partnering with Panorama Education, which is one of the largest private organizations, for-profit organizations that produces these surveys. So they have partnered with Panorama, who works very closely with CASEL. Jennifer nicely explained being aware of the transformative SEL that CASEL has embraced. So people that work with them embrace the same ideology. So the school district notified parents on November 12th that their students were going to be taking these Panorama surveys. The surveys were going to be given on November 15th. Well, that did not give parents any opportunity to really look into the surveys, ask questions about the surveys, ask the point of the survey, or find out about opting out. The notification that came from the district about the students taking the survey didn't mention the opportunity for the families to opt out. So that was a very kind of last minute notification, which didn't really give parents their opportunity to do their due diligence and to look into the opportunity to opt their child out of the survey. Now, there is a federal regulation, the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, PPRA, which allows parents to opt their children out of these surveys. But if you don't know that you have that opportunity, then of course you're not going to take advantage of that opportunity. So you can see on the screen the verbiage of the PPRA, which allows the parent to opt the child out. We have this on our Defending Ed website. If you look up Barrington School District, you can read this, this description. But this is something that a lot of parents don't know about as it relates to the surveys. So that's what happened in Barrington. The parents were not given notification of their opportunity to opt out. They were not given enough time to even ask questions. And the next thing they knew, the survey was being given to the students. Another issue with transparency that has happened in Virginia is when parents have opted their students out of the survey, either that information is not getting recorded, and that's just not in Virginia, that's across the country, what we've heard from parents. When they are opting out, the school is not recording that notification, and they're attempting to give the students the surveys anyway. And we've also received tips from parents who have said, you know, my child, usually younger children, are approached in the classroom. In one instance, a teacher told a child that she was really disappointed that the child's parents had decided to opt them out of taking the survey. And the child almost acquiesced to take the survey, but another teacher stepped in and said, no, that parent, you know, that child has an opt out, so that child will not be taking the survey. When you look at the actual questions on this survey, I think it's really important to think back about what Jennifer said about really the race and the equity focus of this transformative SEL and really shifting the lens of children. I'm going to give you some examples of some of the questions that they're asking on these surveys. Now, keep in mind, some districts like Barrington, the children would be taking these surveys twice a year. In some other districts, the children are taking them 4 times a year. So we really are giving a lot of surveys to our children and taking a lot of class time, because some of these surveys take 30 minutes. So that's a lot of questions. And what they try to do is ask so many questions that if kids are kind of just randomly putting down answers, that they will eventually get some data that they'll find useful. And by they, I mean Panorama, which then gets put into a whole mental health assessment document and information, which is then shared with the school. So some of these questions don't sound so terrible initially, but when you really think about what is the purpose, and that Panorama works closely with Castle, it really gives you pause to think about what are they trying to get from children with these questions. Some of them start out very simple. Overall, how much do you feel like you belong at school? How connected do you feel to the adults at school? During the past week, how often did you feel sad? Now, keep in mind, and a lot of these questions, you know, are being asked of adolescents who, any time of the day, if you ask them these questions, depending upon how lunch went, depending upon how they did on a test, depending upon how things went with their friends, they're going to give you different answers, right? So they're asking, you know, those kinds of questions. Then they're moving on to the more equity and race-based types of questions. For example, how often do you think about what someone of a different race, ethnicity, or culture experiences? Then they have another question. How confident are you that students at your school can have honest conversations with each other about race? I've seen questions of asking students about how fairly do you think your teachers treat students of different racial backgrounds? You know, do you feel that your teachers embrace diversity? Things like that. So keep in mind, these questions are often asked of kids on these surveys when they're coming into school first thing in the morning, bam, right off the bat, in a period that they're used to call homeroom and are now calling advisory. They are being bombarded with these surveys, sitting at these computers, thinking about these really complex, difficult questions that don't have a clear answer, and really are trying to get at bigger, you know, equity-based, bigger SEL issues. And a child is sitting at a computer answering these questions and then hitting submit. So those are pretty heavy questions for kids to have at the forefront of their mind going into their academic school day. And I've talked to a lot of students about these questions and these surveys. And I've spoken to seniors in high school who have said to me, oh, that was, you know, there were some strange questions. It was really confusing. I didn't really know how to answer the questions. I didn't know what they were getting at. None of the answers that I could choose from were really appropriate to how I would have answered the question. So, and these are, you know, 16, 17-year-olds. These same types of questions are being targeted to 3rd graders, 4th graders. So that's really going to set the kids off for a certain attitude and certain thoughts in their minds as they're starting their academic day. And that's why some parents are concerned about what's being asked on these surveys and why it's important for them to know that they can opt their children out.
Thank you, Marissa. And I would just add that my experience with these surveys also as a parent, but also as someone who's looking at surveys from all over the country, is that they focus a lot on gender identity and sexual orientation, including with very young children. So children are coming home saying, you know, I had to fill out this thing and it asked me if I was pansexual or demisexual or bisexual, or and they're saying, I don't even know what these words are. And the same thing happened where I believe it was on my son's survey, actually, where, you know, they're asking 11-year-olds if they're gender fluid. And again, like, it's like taking a concept that's not even on their radar at all, and then not only putting it on their radar, but confusing them and making them feel unsure about how to even answer that question.
Right. And I would just add to that, that the lingering effect of that is, again, what I was talking about. Now you're setting the kids out to do their academic learning. These are complicated, complex questions when you really think about them, and you're bringing up concepts and ideas to children who do not understand the questions. But it's, you know, they always say, you know, children are resilient, and, you know, that we're kind of seeing that play out now. But these questions are providing like lingering concerns for children that is really not being addressed the way that it should be.
And the last thing I would say is that it's none of the school's business anyway. So, you know, even if somebody does know how to answer that question, like, what business is it of yours? Why are you asking this? Okay, so we're going to go back to Rhyen with one more story related to social emotional learning from another district.
Yep. So the next story we have is about Howard County in Maryland. And they have, we have emails that reveal that they've got a grant, which we're not entirely sure where it comes from, but a $25,000 grant to secure a rainbow liaison at every school. And this is a plan to integrate LGBTQ curriculum into an elementary school. So, and I'll read the actual email that we have here in front of me is, hello, attached is an article that was shared with HCPSS. Please read it when you have a moment, or at least save it a spot you can read later. Beginning next year, plans to incorporate LGBTQ within our elementary curriculum. It's never too soon to begin integrating, some of these ideas during your SEL time, especially at the intermediate level. And Jennifer, the question I have for you with this is an entry, not just into high school. This is an entry into elementary, into our youngest of kids. We're talking, you know, 1st through 5th graders, and they want to implement in LGBTQ ideology into SEL time. Especially, you know, for those that are a little more academic, that's, you know, gender and queer theory. How does this relate to Castle and the SEL curriculum that they've put out?
Mm-hmm. Because the competencies that I spoke about, the self-awareness and self-management specifically, are a heavy influence in the younger grades, because they want these children to see this LGBTQ lifestyle as normal, and that it is just what, you know, it's just how it is. It's a new social norm that they are pushing. So they start to influence these children at a very young age, because once they get these kids to understand all of these different identities and accept them as truth, then they start to move them towards that responsible decision making based on all of these identities. So it lines directly up with Castle and their competencies. And they do this at a very young age. We're already seeing it with books about teaching them their pronouns, having kids come in and say, you know, what is your preferred pronouns? And these kids don't even know what a pronoun is at this point. So it's all about conditioning these children for this new social norm that they are pushing.
But don't we want to be inclusive? You know, I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here, but don't we want to be inclusive and you know, we want to, you know, teach the kids, the youngest kids to accept each other as they are, et cetera. So how, you know, you want to respond to that?
Yes. So you know, in schools, we've always taught children to be respectful of others, and to use your manners. And even if you don't like the way that someone believes, then, that's okay. But, for the government institution to come in and influence these children in a way that absolutely undermines parents and what may be taught at home is a huge problem. That's a different area, and that comes in with the transformative SEL.
And Jennifer, would you say that it's accurate to say that when schools talk about social emotional learning or SEL, they do not mention the LGBTQ based lessons, but then that content shows up in the actual lessons in real time?
Yeah. Yes, they use innocuous language, and they will tell the parents that we're teaching them to be leaders. We are teaching them empathy. We are teaching them to build relationships and collaboration, and all of these words that sound nice, but they have a different meaning through the transformative SEL.
I'm going to ask you to share something with viewers that you shared when I first heard you speak, and it's about, it involves a girl and a restroom. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So when I was working at the school and became concerned about social emotional learning, one of the things that I noticed was that these competencies were teaching children to compromise. And of course, again, compromise is good. We want our children to learn that skill, but they're being influenced to compromise everything. And no matter what you were taught at home, no matter what your values are. And so one of the things that I had talked about was at our school, we were teaching children through role playing, which is often used in SEL, and we would give them a scenario and we would tell them a skill to use, and it would be influencing them to compromise, and they are told that this is how you succeed in life. You just use this all the time. And at the same time that year, my school transitioned their restrooms and locker rooms to be inclusive. And so, meaning that any child can go and use whatever restroom of their choice based on whatever identity that they feel they are. So the idea behind that would be, for instance, at the time I had a daughter that was in first grade. And so if she needed to go to the restroom, and there was a boy in the restroom or a male teacher in the restroom using the restroom, the idea would be for her to, what we would tell them is to seek first to understand before you are understood. And so it is all about getting these children to compromise in the idea of these new social norms that they want the children to accept and then advocate for eventually.
So in that scenario, the first grade girl is supposed to understand and be more concerned about the males in the bathroom and why they may want to use the bathroom than she is about how uncomfortable and potentially unsafe she feels in the bathroom.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so when parents hear, we're just teaching your children empathy, you have to understand it isn't necessarily the way you would want your child to be empathetic. So that's what they're doing. They're influencing children and conditioning them through this transformative SEL to accept and advocate for new social norms, like the inclusive restrooms.
Wow. So that's sheer manipulation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So next question, and then we're going to wrap up, is what can be done? Marissa, what can be done?
So the most important thing that can be done is for parents to be engaged, to ask questions, to read everything that comes from your school. Read your PTA newsletter. Read your weekly email from your principal. Talk to your teachers. Get to know your teachers. Talk to your children. Find out what is going on during their school day. Find out from your school. Many of these schools now have equity committees. So you can find out from your teacher, your principal, your equity committee, your student services representative, what is the SEL plan at your school? Now, it's not as clear cut as that, because we have in schools now, we see SEL carve out specific lessons and lesson time, which is usually happening during the advisory period. We are seeing the surveys that are being given to children. And we're also seeing SEL and social emotional learning concepts making their way into, in some schools, almost every subject: math, science, history, certainly English. So those are kind of the different areas where they're getting SEL in. So you need to know from your child, do you have an SEL lesson today? If your child does have an SEL lesson, let's say next week, what's the topic of that lesson? That's going to take phone calls. That's going to take emails. That's going to take the parent taking action to ask those questions. And you have to be very persistent, because in my experience, they don't always want to share what the lesson plans are, which should be a big red flag for you. If someone is saying, oh, it's just a lesson about gratitude, which I heard 3 times from one school, nobody needs 3 lessons in gratitude in 3 weeks. And when I asked more and more information about, well, how exactly are you going to be teaching gratitude? I got more and more information, which then they gave me the concept they were going to be using. I Googled it. It led me to Panorama, and it had a link to Castle. So we need to ask questions about what's going on and about what our kids are learning in school, and get your hands on the lesson plans. The other super important thing that you need to take away from today is opt out. You can opt out. In many districts, you can opt your students out of the social emotional learning lesson. You can definitely opt your children out of the surveys. So take advantage of that opportunity, because finding out what's going on at the school, changing your school's policy about social emotional learning, changing your state's policy about social emotional learning, those things take time. So it's good to work on those and to work with your school board. But most immediately, if you take your child out of the situation, out of the SEL class, out of participating in the social emotional learning survey, that's a great place to start. So definitely look into that. If you don't see that information readily available, call your school board, and look into it. I have a great example of some kids in a local school. You know, we always say courage is contagious. Well, I also now start to say opting out is contagious. We did a big push to let a district know that they could opt out of an upcoming survey. Parent groups in the area enhanced that, and they also did a big push. So in this particular school, they had originally at the beginning of the year, prior to everyone really talking a lot about the opportunity to opt out, they had maybe a handful of students who would opt out of SEL and would go to the library, which is a very small library. Well, I found out from a parent after this big push to inform people about opt-outs, they ended up moving these kids to the cafeteria because they had over 70 students who were now opting out. So, you know, when somebody finds out their friend is not in homeroom, why weren't you in homeroom? Oh, I opted out of that. Oh, I didn't know I could opt out of that. So then those children go home and ask their parents about it, and they don't want to be in the social emotional lesson participating in it. So then their parents can then opt them out. So I think just like courage is contagious, opting out is contagious too. And another thing, another success that we had was a great district in North Carolina, Catawba. They actually had parents participate in their public comment portion of their school board meetings, talking about wanting to end their contract with Panorama because the parents thought it was taking time out of school. It was changing the focus. They didn't want the influence of Panorama or Castle on the students. So they made their case at the school board meeting. And when the school board took a vote, they successfully removed Panorama from their school. And even the superintendent said they were not getting any real usable, important, helpful data from doing the surveys. So they ended their $38,000 contract. So that was a big win, and a big win for parents. So if you keep the pressure on your school board, keep the pressure on your officials, come together with other parents, you can see great results and great strides in kind of tamping down on some of the social emotional learning that's going on in your school.
Thanks, Marissa. All right. So we are going to shift now to audience questions, and quite a few have come in. One that jumps out at me, because I often have this thought also, is it seems like teachers are almost tinkering with students' minds, but it also seems like they don't have the training to be doing this kind of work. Should we be concerned about that? Jennifer, I kind of think that might be a good question for you.
That is what they're doing. Social emotional learning also brings in neuroscience that they give very little training to the teachers on, but they just give them techniques to do with the children that talks about literally rewiring the neuroplasticity in these kids' brain for this new growth perspective. So I think that's a big concern. Now they're doing these techniques. That's where you get a lot of the mindfulness with the social emotional learning and things like that. But the training that they have will be maybe an hour here, an hour there of the professional development, like we talked about earlier. And then they are to take what they gather from that into the classrooms. And then the counselors in the schools are also a big part of this. So I think it's a huge concern. And I would be asking my school if they are using any of those type of techniques.
Okay.
Can I add, Erika, to that?
Oh, sure.
To validate her comments is having just left the classroom at the school I was at, the school counselor was the one in charge of all the SAL curriculum. In fact, that counselor would build the curriculum and so forth, and then just disseminate it out to us. And then we would execute the curriculum, whatever they wrote. There was never really any SEL training for us in that regard. We just, here's your lesson plans, go teach this. And there were times where videos were supposed to be played that included, like our last story about Howard, where it had the gender and queer theory involved in it. And there were videos that were related to that. So parents definitely need to be asking those questions about, who's writing this curriculum? Where is it coming from? How much education are teachers getting? Because like Jennifer just said, there's a game being played with neuroscience and neuropsychology, and teachers, unfortunately, I think they should be, but teachers are not educated enough in that background.
Okay. Another question is asking about, does this social emotional work take time away from academic classes like math and science?
Yeah.
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. So definitely. I mean, the surveys alone, some of them take a half an hour. The social emotional learning at some schools have a 30-minute once a week carve out. Some schools, it's more often than that. So all of that time and effort that is going into these lessons and the time to take the surveys, to implement the lesson, that is 30 minutes or more a week that is not being spent on math, not being spent on science, not being spent on history. Think about how many times at the end of the school year, and you've all been teachers, think how many times at the end of the school year, you'll hear a teacher say, oh, we didn't get to that. Oh, we didn't get to that chapter. We were going to get through chapter 15 on math, but we just didn't get a chance. So we're ending up on chapter 13. So if you want to work on the last two chapters over the summer, so you're ready for next year, you can do that. I mean, we always hear how there's not enough time in the day for teachers to be teaching their subject matter. But we're handing over this precious time, especially now with significant learning loss, when every second is precious. We are just doing these carve outs that are not focused on anything academic.
And Jennifer and Rhyen, have you seen the SEL actually not only, Marissa's talking about carve outs, but are you seeing the SEL actually show up in the academic classes so that it becomes a part of the math, the science, the English class?
Yes.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, social emotional learning, they have the specific carve out lessons like she's talking about, but the social emotional learning is a system that is to be integrated into everything, and that includes their academics, a heavy focus on it in the academics. So for example, they may read a book at a younger age that would deal in the gender ideology. And so even though they're not teaching a lesson to these small children on gender ideology, they're reading them a book, and then they have a lesson outside with that book that we would typically think, right, of they're learning what a noun is, right? But they just integrate these ideas consistently into the day, into the academics, and that is part of the conditioning and influence.
Yeah, and what was happening at the school that I left was they saw they felt there would need to be a greater need for more social emotional learning. So they were restructuring the entire school day schedule to give the end of the day a class time for that, where they would do lessons, 3 to 4 day lessons specifically on things. For example, one teacher was very excited about a whole unit on racial justice as part of their SEL. And I would agree with Jennifer that it was encouraged to bring those things into your lessons. Now, I also want to be fair, because let's go back and say that not all of these lessons, not all these schools are pushing this, gender queer theory and so forth into the system, anti-racism. Mm-hmm. So there are lessons that are valuable. There are character. Let's use character education versus SEL. So there are valuable character education pieces that I would actually, we probably all would agree with, need to flow through lessons as at least as a conversation within. Hey, do you remember when we were talking about this? So parents I want to make sure parents know to differentiate and to do their homework on this with that piece, because that's important that we're not tearing out everything that might be valuable for these kids.
And actually, on that point, I'm going to move to our last question for Jennifer. And it is, if people want to do a deeper dive and really learn more about SEL, and specifically about, what is it called again? Transformative SEL, where would they look to find more information?
Sure. So I would suggest that they go to the CASEL website, which is CASEL.org, and start reading it. Just understand what we've talked about today, that a lot of the transformative SEL comes through that equity lens. So when you see the innocuous language they're using, just understand that it's coming through in that way. And then I think one of the websites I would suggest people look at is Learning for Justice. I think it's .org. And it's a huge SEL resource. You will find them as a resource for many of the different programs in CASEL, and it really gives you an idea of what these transformative SEL lessons look like. And Learning for Justice was created by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is probably going to be concerning to people. I think it should be. And then if you go to my website, jennifermcwilliamsconsulting.com, I am traveling the country and educating communities on this and how to fight this in their own school districts. And I would love to connect with people.
And I only have about 10 seconds left, but can you just name the companies that you think that parents should be the most aware of in terms of SEL programs in school districts?
Yes, CASEL, Panorama Education, and we didn't talk about it, but I would look at the American School Counseling Association.
Great. All right. And everybody, I think that hopefully what we're leaving everyone with is the understanding that awareness is key. And that if you are hearing things from your children or seeing materials that where your parent red flag just goes up or something doesn't feel right in your gut, ask questions. You have a right to information under federal law. You have a right to view all instructional materials. So just ask. They may put up a brick wall and slam the door in your face, but keep knocking at it and do what you can to find out. Also, we are here as a resource always, so you can reach out to us at defendinged.org. If you have concerns, you're not really sure whether you should feel concerned about something, or you just want more information, or maybe you need a little bit of help in figuring out what to ask. So again, we are always here to help you. We are really grateful that you spent this hour with us tonight to learn more about social emotional learning, what it is and what it isn't. I'm so grateful to all of my guests tonight for sharing their wealth of knowledge and expertise. And with that, I'm going to say good night, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.